Next turn is Tyler Jobson. Tyler is a young, promising researcher, and Tyler is a pupil of Nicola, and he is in charge. I think I can say so. You're in charge of the digital aspects of the Gabi excavation. Gabi excavations, thanks to the impulse of Nicola, has always been one step beyond in this digital issue. And actually, they showed us that the matter is not just precision and accuracy, but the matter is also how this can be put at stake in terms of publication. The publication of Gabi is really an example for all of us. And so Tyler will also talk about this, I think. So Tyler, your turn. 3D survey and the digital field to publication pipeline at the Gabi project.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. Thanks, Marco. Thanks to the department. Thanks, Andrea. Thanks to everybody who's made this possible. So I'm going to, yes, talk a bit about 3D recording at the University of Michigan's Gabi project, and in particular, the steps that we take to ensure that the data that we record in the field makes its way into peer-reviewed publication. And not just makes its way into publication, but really enhances and kind of defines the modality with which we disseminate our results. Wait, no, what about? Okay, so we hope the projector is now cooperating. I'll say that the workflow and kind of the approach that I'm going to describe here is still something that we are constantly refining and improving. But what we've settled on now, which is the result of more than a decade of experimentation and trial and error, what we've settled on now is something that works for us and for our needs as an excavation. So this is one example of how a digital excavation can operate, but I think that some of the lessons will be hopefully of interest to all of us. And definitely I'm going to hit on some themes that have already been discussed and will certainly continue to be discussed throughout the afternoon, especially the need to really be intentional about the ultimate goal of survey in the field, and then to take steps that are really conducive to meeting those goals. So just a brief outline, I'm going to discuss a few questions and problematics and state of the art, and then talk about the tool set we use in the field, talk about the ultimate workflow, how we tie that tool set together, and then take a look at volume 2 in our publication series to kind of see the end result of that. So I'll begin by just posing a few questions that, even though they've been discussed really a lot over the past few decades, are still very much open questions. What purpose should field survey, in particular 3D field survey, serve? Precision, accuracy, quantity, all these things, and really asking these questions kind of forces us to get at the heart of what survey is all about, even using conventional techniques like hand drawing. And in particular, once we introduce the digital aspect, the 3D aspect, how does that serve, or does it serve to augment, right, the normal way that archaeology was recorded in the field before the introduction of these technologies? Or is it should it be seen as like an interruption of the normal way of doing business? If we don't ask these questions, there's a risk of falling into what I call the assembly line mentality, right? Which is the assumption that bigger, faster data is always better data, right? And this is kind of what Christopher Tilley was warning us against 30-something years ago, right? That we might continue to amass data, yet our understanding doesn't necessarily improve just because of that. So I'm going to talk about a few things, kind of background before getting into Gabi, and all of these things are going to be important for sort of understanding our approach. So the first one is that a lot of archaeologists, precisely because that there is this risk of this assembly line mentality, have reflected not on necessarily what is being gained by new field survey techniques, but what might be lost by them, right? So a good example is this 2018 piece by Morgan and Wright, in which they call hand drawing the mediated expression of the archaeological resource. In other words, drawing, according to these authors, is what supplies meaning to what we discover in the field, and ultimately what allows us to build narratives and tell stories about what we discover in the field. So Morgan and Wright in this piece don't necessarily call for a rejection of new technologies, but they encourage us to see 3D survey and digital survey within this long tradition of hand drawing, right? And to be intentional about the way that we deploy these new technologies. On the other hand, some of the people who specialize in 3D have said that 3D survey is not really an interruption, but potentially an improvement over conventional techniques. And this is a point that people have been making for quite a while. So already in the early 90s, Paul Riley, whose work was really important in introducing these themes to archaeology, made the point, for example, that a section drawing is by necessity a partial and biased view of any stratigraphic sequence. So you might choose a line along which to draw a section that you think is the most representative of a structure or a stratigraphic sequence, but the very fact that the object of that drawing is being cut and sliced means that information is being lost, right? So Riley kind of saw 3D as a way of potentially getting us past this what he called a biased and partial view. And one could make the argument in this vein that what 3D recording might lack and the immediate kind of interpretive signaling that hand drawing and conventional drawing has, and makes up for in providing a more complete view that later on can be developed and used to support multiple interpretations or multiple perspectives on whatever was recorded in the field, right? Rather than just being filtered through the view of whoever it was who was responsible for sort of drawing it in that moment. Okay, so I like going back to the early days of 3D because it shows that a lot of these things that we're discussing are not necessarily new problems, but they're different. We have to approach them differently given new technologies that are available. And then, at the same time, I'd like to point out that a major thrust of 3D visualizations of the past have been where I think some of the most innovation and creativity in terms of interaction and storytelling have come from has had nothing to do at all with any of these sort of methodological archaeological questions. Okay, and I'm talking in particular about video games and other forms of visualization that are sort of geared toward a public audience, right, including tourists or visitors to cultural heritage sites. So this is an early example that we're looking at, Caesar 2 from 1995, but it's an interesting one because this game comes out precisely during the time that Paul Riley is arguing for 3D as sort of a theoretical revolution in archaeology, and also contemporaneous with the boom of GIS in archaeology, which in a lot of ways represented kind of the epitome of the technological epitome of processional approaches, right? Caesar 2 in games of this era had nothing to do with any of this, but they inspired a new generation of academics who were thinking that maybe, game engines and 3D visualization is a way of telling a story that kind of transcends the sort of positivistic limitations of things like GIS or even just conventional field survey. And that gets us to the last thing that I'd like to hit on before talking about Gabi, which is the concept of immersive reconstructions, which run the range of a lot of different approaches, but almost always have kind of a more emic, post-processual, phenomenological mentality behind them, right? Perhaps precisely because immersive reconstructions, which really in the late 90s and early 2000s started to take off, perhaps because they were drawing so much upon the language often of video games, a lot of scholars didn't really know what to make of this sort of thing. And I would say this is somewhat different now than it was 20 or even 10 years ago. But right around the 2000s, there was kind of this massive rush toward trying to develop best practices, right? Standards of best practice for reconstructing and visualizing ancient environments. And I don't have a lot of time to get into those, but what I would say is that among academics working on immersive reconstructions, there's really not been a rush to adapt any one or the other set of these best practices. And I think that speaks to the fact that, and Cristiano kind of touched on this too a bit in his talk, it speaks to the fact that while it's somewhat straightforward to standardize workflows and sort of, methodologies in the field in terms of data capture, it's a lot harder to standardize storytelling, dissemination, and ultimately the construction of knowledge, right? The production of new forms of archaeological knowledge. That's a harder thing to standardize. It depends a lot on what your specific goals are, what your data is, what your perspective is. So all of these lessons have kind of been essential. These are sort of the different things that we have tried to navigate in the formulation of our approach to Gabi. So just a few words to remind ourselves where we are. There's been a massive boom in 3D field reporting since 2000, first with laser scanners, and then with structured motion photogrammetry, virtual reality, augmented reality, all kinds of 3D visualization are increasingly components in the cultural heritage industry. And then there's also, increasingly the digitization of things beyond survey in the field, like contact sheets, fines, ledgers, all these things that used to be paper-based are now increasingly digital. In terms of research and development, right, we have the continued use of GIS, which, as Giacomo just pointed out, is now better for 3D data than it used to be. The capabilities are expanding. Experimentation with technologies like BIM, which is going to be another topic, an ongoing topic throughout today. Homegrown solutions, right? Ways of deploying 3D data to the web. All of these things, all of these areas of research are really productive, laudable, and important. One thing that is often missing from conversations about these various technologies is how you package things up for peer-reviewed publication. And again, not just how you publish, but how you use 3D data to enhance publications. So this is where we think we can bring something to the table at the Gabi project. So the first thing I'll say is that at Gabi, our approach to using 3D, and indeed the development of this entirely digital pipeline that I'm going to now discuss, is based on a few goals. The most important one is to use new technologies, not just to amass data like an assembly line, but really to deploy it and to use it to produce archaeological narratives that are meaningful, thoughtful, and reflective, right? A secondary goal is to be holistic about our approach to data collection, to not put all of our eggs in one basket, not to rely on any one technology, but to find a link between several technologies. And so this is, what has encouraged us, for example, in our publications to mix 3D data with more traditional forms of 2D representation like plans and photographs, and also to integrate, both quantitative and qualitative approaches to interpretive reasoning in our publications. So we're trying to have a well-rounded and balanced approach. Just a few brief words about, general introduction to the site of Gabi. So we're talking about a major Latin settlement in the vicinity of Rome with roughly contemporaneous origins. With the University of Michigan, we've been excavating there since 2009. This followed a large-scale magnetometry survey, which revealed the settlement's overall layout. And in the meantime, we've been working to recover data both through public and private buildings that tell the story of the origins and ultimately the abandonment and death of this settlement. Okay. We envision ourselves as part of a collective push, which I think everyone here in the room in some way is taking part in, to make digital excavations the new normal, okay? And we're trying to accomplish that by using a multi-pronged tool set, okay, multiple technologies. So I'm now going to kind of run through that tool set. Total station survey is the first thing. So we're certainly not unique in using any of these technologies, but I will say that the key thing to know about the way we run total station survey at Gabi, its primary application is to survey the limits of every context that we uncover, okay? And that's everything from structural, walls, pavements, to deposits, cuts, right? Any context that we have is surveyed, and this results in the amassment of thousands of lines of vectorial data every season. Databases, so we've been, I think since 2015 or 2014, we've been entirely paperless at Gabi. Okay, so we have a field database, an operating field database, and data is entered into that database directly in the field through tablets. So this helps us to resolve the question of secondhand data entry, right, allows us to sort of implement more mechanisms of quality control and to protect a bit against data loss. Structure for motion photogrammetry, similarly to total stations, we're not unique in using this, but I think the big contribution that we have is every context, no matter how seemingly small or insignificant, is surveyed, is captured in 3D. We call it photo model. So we photo model every stratigraphic unit, not just architecture, but everything from deposits, cuts, the whole gamut. So the workflow, how we tie this all together, removal of a context, still not digital, but we'll see. Identification of new contexts in total station survey of the limits. And I really want to underscore here the importance of this step, consultation between the surveyors and the excavators, okay? Often through, for example, often the surveyors will review the hand drawings of the excavators and consult with them directly in order to help determine the limits. So here, this is, we think it's important to be reflective and communicative and to ensure that the brain power that went into identifying a new context is, transferred to the survey, right? That the surveyor is sort of aware archaeologically of what's going on. And this just helps us be more coordinated and be more intentional about the way that we record our data. Then the capture of that context after total station survey with structure for motion photogrammetry and entry of context sheet data using tablets directly.
That's such a typical racing game.
So yeah, going back to the kind of question that I posed at the beginning, what purpose does all of this data serve, right? And this is where we get into our publication. So we have committed in collaboration with the University of Michigan Press to an entirely digital monograph series, open access and hosted by the University of Michigan. And the key components of these publications is a combination of textual narrative, which in some ways is kind of a conventional, approach to publishing a monograph, but we have sort of our own flavor, and I'll mention that in a second, combined with a 3D interface designed with the game engine Unity, okay, to showcase our 3D data. And underlying all of that is a sort of revised and polished version of our field database, right? So we try to basically use these 3 different windows to provide access to our data using multiple modalities. So I'm going to just switch over really quick and we're going to take a quick look. So I kind of,
You probably need to share the video.
Oh, yeah.
oh, okay. So you want to help me with that, Mark?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so this, I've just jumped into kind of a more or less random page here. So you'll note that just to sort of orient what we're looking at here, on the left, we have this kind of book-like text pane, right? So this is more or less functions like an ebook with pages that we have down here. Table of contents, right? So on the left, I would say is the more familiar things for a reader of books, right? One thing I'll point out is that the division of the book, the textual aspect of the book is into sort of multiple levels of narrative that we envision being directed toward multiple audiences, right? So we try to make this we try to basically capture as wide of an audience as possible, from specialists of the various topics we handle in archaeology to even members of the general public. On the right, we have our 3D pane, which I'll take a look at in more detail here in a second. And then the database, which is currently off the screen, but we'll take a look at that as well. So you'll notice that to the left, there are hyperlinks, right, in the text. And some of these links go to the database, but the majority of them, especially when we're mentioning specific SUs, help us navigate the 3D scene, right? So the 3D scene developed with Unity can both be pre-explored, right, in this kind of bird's eye view and also first-person view, like as if it's a video game. And every stratigraphic unit in this area is represented by these cute little trowel icons, which when clicked give just some basic information about each SU. Okay, definition, we also have kind of activity tags that explain, you know, how each SU is related to various activities that are observed in the area throughout the sequence. Photos, okay, simple photos, and links. So I'll say there's sort of two links happening here. One is to the database. So we'll see how quickly that loads, maybe hop back to it. And the other is to the text itself. So similarly to how you can navigate from the text to an SU, right? Like I want to learn about SU 1055, here it is, okay? If you're in the 3D scene and you find an SU, here's 1413, show me where that's mentioned in the text, right? This is another, so there's kind of two-way dialogue going on there. And one thing I'll say about this area, so the area that we're looking at in this publication was the first that was dug in 2009. So this is kind of before we had really settled on our workflow of 3D. So what you're noticing is all these white ghostly polygons, that's the total station survey. We did not have a lot of 3D models of standing architecture or even stratigraphic deposits because, again, it just predated the adoption of our sort of total workflow. What we do have, however, are really nice models of the tombs that were excavated in this area. So just take a look at one here. So we packaged up, we made this kind of tomb viewer for the tombs here that allowed the reader to basically re-excavate, right, each stratigraphic unit in the tomb. Okay, and then of course there are links to the database page as well from the tomb. Let's see if that database page loaded up just to give you a visual of each stratigraphic unit is represented in the database, right? So this sort of tomb viewer is kind of an idea of where we're going for our future publications, where we have better and more complete data sets, right? We're sort of imagining that this way of viewing stratigraphy can be applied to every sequence, right, in our future publications. So I will now go back to the PowerPoint. Marco. Yeah. Thanks. Okay, so just a few, yeah. This is just, meant to kind of recap what I just said, right? So basically we have the kind of dialogue between the 3D and text, right? We have links from both the text and the 3D to the database, right? So this is sort of a schematic look at how all these parts are interlinked in our publications. So just the last two slides here, I want to say what we consider to be some of the accomplishments of this, providing a path forward, right? A way of pipelining 3D data and all forms of digital field data into a peer-reviewed publication. Also think to a new type of immersive visualization. So usually, right, what I've mentioned before, immersive visualizations, when you hear that word, you usually think reconstructions of the past, right? But this is really immersion in a site as excavated, right? We think that this is a worthy path to explore and to continue to develop. Data transparency, right? Major advantages over the print book format. This simply the quantity of data that you can provide, and not just quantity, but a way, multiple tools for accessing that data in a meaningful way. And I'll say that, in general, the reviews that we've received have been good, both reviews from people that are specialists in 3D and digital approaches, and also from archaeologists whose background is slightly more conventional, right? So we're happy with that. Some of the challenges is that anything new like this is risky, and you open yourself up in particular to criticisms, not just of your archaeology and your interpretation, but of the way that you published it, right? So here was a particularly negative review that we got in 2017. And I put that up here, not just to be sardonic, but to say that we take all the feedback that we get very seriously, right? So this feedback that we got in 2017 was an inspiration for us to improve. And this was before volume 2, which I just showed you. So this was after following the first volume. So that was an inspiration for us to improve volume 2. And similarly, volume 3 that's on the horizon, we are changing the interface to match that particular data set, because each area at Gabi is sort of its own beast and has its own demands, right, on the way that it's published, but also responding to some of the feedback that we've received, which perhaps in the discussion, if anyone's interested, later on, I can talk about in more detail. But that's what I have for you. So thank you very much for